For many years, Hungary did not advance. It defended, endured, and waited. The war along its frontier had become familiar. Fortresses stood where they always had. Armies moved, then withdrew. Borders shifted slightly, only to return to the same place. Nothing truly changed. Then, in 1595, that pattern broke. For the first time in decades, Hungary stopped preparing to hold ground and chose to take it back. The target was clear: Esztergom. The city stood above the Danube River, not merely as stone and walls, but as control. The Danube was a lifeline. Trade moved along it, armies moved along it, supplies followed its current. Whoever held Esztergom could watch that river, influence it, and when necessary, cut it. When the Ottomans captured Esztergom decades earlier, they did not simply take a city, they gained pressure. From that position, they did not need constant invasions. The fortress itself was enough. Its presence kept central Hungary unstable, always threatened, always exposed. For years, Hungary was forced to accept this reality. Defense became routine. Rivers served as barriers. Border fortresses were meant to buy time. Distance slowed the enemy's advance. As long as Ottoman positions north of the frontier remained isolated, this system could still function. By the early 1590s, it no longer did. The frontier was no longer a line. It had become a zone of constant pressure, and the Danube, once a shield, had begun to serve the Ottoman Empire. Inside Esztergom, the Ottoman commanders understood the value of their position. They knew that if the fortress were threatened, the entire system of control along the river would be shaken. The walls were inspected again. Older sections were reinforced with earth and timber. Artillery positions were adjusted to cover the river and all likely approaches. Grain stores were checked. Gunpowder was measured. Water sources inside the city were placed under strict protection. The garrison trained more frequently. There was no panic, but there was vigilance. Esztergom remained strong, yet these preparations reflected something else. The fortress was no longer protected by certainty. The Ottoman Empire was now fighting on multiple fronts. Its forces were divided. Its main armies marched elsewhere. Esztergom was still formidable, but it was more isolated than ever before. For Hungary and the Habsburg commanders, this raised a different question. The issue was no longer how to defend better north of the Danube. It was whether an Ottoman fortress positioned directly on this river should be allowed to continue to exist at all. Attacking Esztergom was not about expansion. It was about removal. Removing a strategic stronghold that left all of Hungary vulnerable. This decision marked a fundamental shift. Hungary would no longer merely react, no longer only defend. For the first time in many years, the war would move forward across the Danube. And from that moment on, every preparation pointed toward Esztergom. Wars do not begin when the first shot is fired. They begin when people stop pretending nothing will happen. By the late spring of 1595, that moment had arrived. By the late spring of 1595, preparation replaced hesitation. Inside Esztergom, caution hardened into readiness. This was no longer routine maintenance. The fortress commander shifted from preservation to expectation. Signals were established between towers. Messenger routes were tested. Every officer was reminded of his role if the city came under siege. Training intensified. Cannons were not only positioned, but calibrated and rehearsed. Ammunition was distributed closer to firing points to reduce delay once fighting began. Even daily life inside the city adjusted. non-essential movement was restricted. Civilians were directed towards safer inner areas. Food was rationed, with the assumption that resupply might never come. Esztergom was no longer standing guard, it was bracing. Across the frontier, something equally important was happening. For the first time, the Habsburg monarchy stopped observing and started acting. Reports from scouts were no longer filed and forgotten. They were compared, confirmed, and discussed. The conclusion became unavoidable. The Ottomans were preparing for a siege, which meant the fortress could be taken if the response was decisive. In Vienna, hesitation ended quietly. Orders were issued without ceremony. This would not be a raid. It would not be a show of force. It would be a full-scale siege operation. Troops were summoned from across imperial territory. German infantry formed the core of the army, disciplined and trained for prolonged campaigns. Hungarian units were attached for their knowledge of terrain, roads, and river crossings. Italian engineers and artillery specialists were brought in to manage siege guns and fortifications. The army did not assemble in a single dramatic moment. It formed gradually. Columns gathered in different regions and moved along separate routes to avoid early detection. Supplies followed behind, slow and heavy. Cannons were hauled over rough roads. Wagons creaked under the weight of powder and shot. Everyone involved understood the same truth. A siege is not won by speed, it is won by endurance. As the army moved eastward, the tone among the soldiers shifted. This was not a border skirmish they would fight and leave behind. They were marching toward a fortress that had stood for decades, and they were expected to stay until the outcome was decided. By early summer, the advance could no longer be hidden. Ottoman scouts reported movement, large formations, artillery trains, supply columns. There was no doubt now. The enemy was coming. Inside Esztergom, the final phase of preparation began. Defensive plans were reviewed one last time. Fallback positions were designated. Signals for fire, retreat, and reinforcement were clarified. The soldiers understood what this meant. Once the Habsburg army arrived and encamped, the city would be cut off. The Danube would be watched. The roads would close. And from that moment on, Esztergom would stand alone. When the first imperial units reached the hills overlooking the city, both sides were ready. Not confident, not calm, ready. At dawn, mist rose from the river. As it thinned, outlines appeared on the opposite slopes. Gun platforms, earthworks, movement where none had been before. No alarms were shouted, no bells rang. The defenders were already awake. Shortly after sunrise, a single Habsburg cannon fired. It was not meant to destroy anything by itself. It was a measured opening shot, a test of distance, a test of reaction, a declaration without words. The cannonball crossed the river and struck the outer works of Esztergom. Stone cracked, dust spilled downward. The sound echoed inside the city walls. For those inside the fortress, that sound changed everything. This was no longer preparation. This was war. Once the first shot was fired, the pattern was set. Habsburg artillery did not unleash everything at once. Guns opened in sequence, adjusting after each impact. Some batteries focused on sections of wall where stone looked older, where scars from earlier wars were still visible. Others targeted parapets and towers, forcing Ottoman gunners to keep their heads down. Inside Esztergom, the effect became clear with every passing hour. Masonry chipped away, earthworks sagged. Defenders repaired damage where they could, filling gaps with timber and packed earth. Civilians were moved farther inward. Cellars grew crowded. Food stores were guarded. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It settled slowly. Outside the walls, the besieging army fell into routine. Gun crews rotated to avoid exhaustion. Ammunition wagons moved constantly. Engineers observed through smoke, marking impact points and comparing notes. This was not an assault meant to break the city in a single day. It was pressure, hour by hour, stone by stone. By the third week, the siege changed its character. The noise no longer shocked, the smoke no longer surprised. What frightened people now was repetition. Every morning, the guns resumed. Every afternoon, the walls lost a little more of themselves. Every night, repairs became harder to complete. The Habsburg engineers reached the same conclusion. A section of wall on the western side, older and repaired many times before, was weakening faster than the rest. From that moment on, the fire concentrated. Shots landed closer together, impacts overlapped. Inside the fortress, the difference was impossible to ignore. Stones collapsed inward. Cracks spread along the masonry. Temporary repairs no longer held through the night. Ottoman officers responded quickly. More men were assigned to that sector. Earth and timber were piled behind the wall to absorb impact. Cannons nearby shifted fire outward, trying to disrupt the enemy batteries. But the pressure did not ease. Food was rationed more strictly. Ammunition grew scarce. Exhaustion settled over the garrison like a second enemy. In some streets, buildings were dismantled to provide material for emergency defenses. The city was slowly consuming itself to survive. Then, one afternoon, the wall gave way. The collapse was not sudden and not dramatic. A section slumped inward. Stone fell. Dust rose from the Habsburg positions. Observers saw it immediately. Orders moved fast. Infantry was brought forward. Ladders were prepared. Formations tightened. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The assault began without a roar. It began with movement. Under covering fire, soldiers advanced toward the breach. Smoke and debris hid them from clear view. Shots rang out from the walls as Ottoman defenders tried to slow the approach. Fighting became close and confused. Men climbed broken stone. Defenders fired from improvised positions. Commands were shouted over noise that never fully stopped. Inside the fortress, the situation was assessed quickly. The breach was narrow, but vulnerable. More attackers would come. Holding the position would require sacrifices the city might not survive. As evening approached, the commander faced a reality no fortress wants to admit. Esztergom could still resist, but the cost would be catastrophic. Negotiations were opened. By nightfall, the firing slowed. Signals replaced shots. When the banners changed the following day, it was not because courage had failed. It was because endurance had reached its limit. The silence that followed felt unfamiliar. For weeks, the city had known only noise, cannon fire, collapsing stone, the tension of waiting for the next blow. Now there was quiet. Not peace, just the absence of sound. Habsburg soldiers entered carefully. There was no uncontrolled rush. Officers kept units together. Inside the walls, the damage was clear. Fortifications lay broken. Buildings near the defenses were shattered or dismantled. Civilians emerged slowly, trying to understand what had changed and what had not. Ottoman garrison was allowed to leave under terms of surrender. Weapons were laid down. Wounded were treated. There was no sense of shame. They had not been surprised. They had not collapsed in panic. They had held as long as holding was possible. For the Habsburg monarchy, the victory was measured. Esztergom had not fallen in a single dramatic moment. It had been taken through patience, pressure, and time. Repairs began almost immediately. Garrisons were assigned. The fortress was too important to leave exposed. News of the fall traveled quickly along the Danube and across Central Europe. For the Habsburgs, it proved that Ottoman strongholds were not permanent. For the Ottoman Empire, it delivered a warning. Distance and divided attention carried consequences. The capture of Esztergom did not end the war. It changed its direction. The frontier shifted. Confidence shifted with it, and both sides began preparing for what would come next. Because in wars like this, the end of one siege is never the end of the story. It is only the space between chapters.